Earlier in the program, we talked about the Trump administration's latest crackdown on immigration, especially migrants fleeing from South and Central America. That's drawing some parallels to the 1930s. I'm going to quote a piece from Fortune magazine for you. Quote, "Watching the Trump administration decimate U.S. refugee and asylum programs is not only horrific, it is a mistaken return to the equally unenlightened and dangerous refugee policies of the 1930s and early 40s. In both cases, administrative actions were used to deny admission to thousands of refugees and asylum seekers. The most notorious example of the earlier era is the refusal of the U.S. to allow the German ship St. Louis to disembark its passengers prior to the Holocaust. A new book describes that period. It's called The Unwanted: America, Auschwitz, and a Village Caught in Between. I recently sat down with its author, Michael Dobbs. Michael, your book is a Holocaust story, and a Holocaust story far less known than others, but it's also a story about American immigration policy and American politics in the late 1930s. Tell us, if you would, the story of the ship, the St. Louis, and of other German and Nazi-occupied Jews who tried to get to America in the late 30s.
Well, the St. Louis was one of many ships trying to reach, actually in the case of St. Louis, not America, but Cuba. And it was turned back from Cuba. It had about 1,000 passengers on board, all Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. They, having been turned back from Cuba, they tried to get into the United States, but they didn't have American visas. And the immigration at that time was governed by a quota system, and the German quota was already filled, so the ship was turned back and sent back to Europe, not to Nazi Germany, but to countries like England, France, Belgium.
And the St. Louis, I assume, was not an isolated incident. There were other ships, there were other groups of Jews who tried to get to the West but could not?
Right. After Hitler came to power in 1933, and particularly after Kristallnacht in 1938, Jews realized that there was no future for them in Germany. So they all tried to escape Germany by whatever means they could, and the preferred destination was the United States. But some made it and some didn't, and that's really the subject of my book, why it was that the American visa meant the difference between life and death for many German Jews.
Do we know the numbers and the fates of those Jews who were returned to Europe or returned to Germany, and how many of them were eventually killed?
Well, in general terms, there were 500,000 Jews living in Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power, and roughly almost a third were killed in the Holocaust. Actually, that was less than, in proportionate terms, than the number of East European Jews killed in the Holocaust. So 2/3 of German Jews managed to escape, mainly to America, also to Palestine, countries like England, France. But when the war began in 1939, many were trapped in Western Europe. And of course, after Germany invaded Western Europe, it was a real struggle to get out of Western Europe. Some succeeded, some didn't succeed. That's really the theme of my book.
You mentioned that the U.S. quota on immigrants from Germany was full. Was that the only reason why those people and why that ship was denied access? And did Americans know of the anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish policies that were being put into place in Germany even before we heard about the mass murders at concentration camps?
Right. We, at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, did a study of American newspapers reporting on Nazi Germany and the persecution of the Jews. And in general, Americans were pretty well informed about what was taking place in Europe. But there was a very high barriers to immigration. You needed a sponsor. You needed connections in the United States to immigrate to the United States. So it was not a possibility for everybody, tragically.
If the public generally knew what was happening in Germany, one assumes the political leadership also was aware, maybe even more acutely, of what was happening. Was there any push to change the rules and regulations because of the emergency that the circumstance proposed? And was there anything in the political dynamic of the U.S. that prevented any additional action from being taken?
Right. I mean, there were several attempts. For example, children. The UK, Britain, passed a bill, or they allowed many Jewish children from Germany to come to the UK in 1939. And a similar measure was proposed in the US Congress to allow 20,000 Jewish children to come to the United States, and it was turned down by the Congress on the argument that we already have the quota and the quotas are filled. So it kept on. All these measures to expand the numbers of refugees coming to the United States came up against opinion in the Congress, supported by public opinion, which was generally hostile to refugees and immigration. Public opinion polls at the time showed that 80 or 90% of Americans were opposed to more refugees coming into the country.
Do we know, Michael, what drove that anti-refugee mindset in the late 1930s?
I think that it was a product of the general isolationism in the country, particularly after the First World War. During the 19th century, immigration to the U.S. had been virtually unchecked. So at the time of the First World War and after the First World War, there was a very xenophobic mood in the country, which resulted in the passage of stringent immigration laws in the 1920s. Whole sectors of world populations were refused entry completely to the U.S., like Chinese, Asians, and very strict quotas were placed on European populations, particularly Eastern Europe. And of course, many Jews lived in Eastern Europe, so that affected them.
Was anti-Semitism a factor in that thinking among the general public and among lawmakers, or was it simply all folded into, anti-migrant in general?
Right. I mean, if you look at the debates in the 1920s about these immigration laws, certainly there were a number of anti-Semitic remarks. It was mixed in with general xenophobia, so I wouldn't say it was directed only against Jews. It was directed against other groups as well. But certainly there was a kind of snobbishness. I mean, for example, at the time, we know that Jews were excluded from many areas of American life, so that undoubtedly did exist. But the laws were not specifically directed against Jews. And part of the barriers was not just a matter of anti-Semitism or xenophobia, but national security concerns. It was feared, particularly after the fall of France in 1940, that the Nazis would try to infiltrate their agents, fifth columnists, into the United States in the guise of refugees. And so that was one of the arguments used to prevent refugees from coming to this country.
And Michael, the context and the timing of all this, I think, is important too, that we're only so removed from the Great Depression and the economic uncertainty that lingered in the country for years after that, as well as the prelude to war, both uncertain elements and generally uncertainty and times of concern have been times when anti-Semitism and xenophobia have tended to foster in this country, yes?
Right, that's absolutely true, that in the 1930s, as a result of the Depression, there was a feeling we don't want to let foreigners into our country because they might take our jobs. And precisely that argument was used by people in Congress. There's a senator called Robert Reynolds who said that, every refugee coming into the country is a threat to American jobs, means one job taken away from potentially from an American worker.
Were there any lessons taken from this time period, Michael? After the Second World War ended, was there any change to our immigration policy or any other changes after this as a result of the lack of open arms and open doors for these migrants?
Well, two things happened. One, before the war, there was no actual refugee policy. There was no policy of granting asylum to people threatened with persecution. And that was only the asylum policy, the current asylum policy was only introduced after the war. And of course, U.S. immigration law was revised in the 1960s. The quota system was abolished. And as a result of which, many more immigrants and refugees started coming to America from the 1960s onwards.
Finally, Michael, this is not a story about modern politics or modern immigration policy, but I do have to ask, if in your research and telling the story, if you see any lessons that there are from that era that apply or should apply to today.
Well, I was tried to connect this rather abstract political debate in the United States to the stories of specific people in Germany who were trying to get to the US, and make the connection between all the arguments that go on in Washington and the fates of ordinary people. And at that time, it was very clear that if you were denied an American visa, in many cases, the alternative was death, ending up in a Nazi death camp. I mean, it's not quite the same today, but certainly, we talk about immigration and refugees in terms of policy, but there's a human side to it as well, and that's what I tried to stress in my book.
Michael, appreciate the work, appreciate a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
Up next, more of President Trump's interview with George Stephanopoulos, and of course, it's generating yet more controversy.